So in my recent paper on shareholder activism, we try to understand how institutional investors engage with portfolio firms. And this is very important if you think about it, because over the last decades, the ownership by institutional investors in firms across the world has increased dramatically. And so it's very important to understand how these institutional investors engage with their portfolio firms. What do we mean with engagement? It's basically about how they make sure that they get a return on their capital without just being passive. So we try to understand that, and as a means of understanding this, we have decided to make a questionnaire. So we have sent a survey instrument to institutional investors around the world, and in this survey we try to understand by means of asking them how they engage their portfolio firms. And let me also say that apart from becoming more important, institutional investors are interesting because they hold so many firms in their portfolios that it's really interesting to see not just how they engage, but also what the impediments to engagement are. Because some of the biggest investors in the world, they hold something like 6,000 or 7,000 firms. If you hold so many firms in your portfolio, it's very difficult to really understand what's going on in all of them. So what are the impediments? When do they engage? What are the triggers? These are the questions we try to understand in our questionnaire. And when we talk about shareholder activism, we really mean how these institutional investors start engaging their firms, try to change firms, try to make changes to the strategy and the corporate governance. So if you think about the ways that institutional investors can engage with portfolio firms, there are basically two options. The first option is called voice. Why is it called voice? Well, because it means that these investors go into the firms and actively start to get a change in the portfolio firms. So voice can be many things. It could be talking to the executive board, it could be talking to the supervisory board or the non-executive directors, but it could also be voting against management at the annual shareholder meeting. It could be suing managers. It could be proposing their own candidates for the supervisory board or as non-executive directors. So this is all voice. But there's another important mechanism that people call exit or the Wall Street walk. So exit is something very different. Exit is basically a threat by institutional investors that if the portfolio companies don't improve governance and performance, they will sell the shares. So why is this a credible threat? Think of yourself being a manager in such a portfolio company. If the institutional investor has a big stake and comes to you and says you should change this or this or this, and you don't do this, so they may sell the firm's shares. And if they sell the shares in the firms, this will depress the stock price. Now you as a manager, you are aware of this and you're worried about the stock price going down because you may hold shares in the company, you may have stock options. So if investors come and ask for change and you don't implement that and they are selling the shares as a result, you will suffer yourself. So these are the two basic options that we can think of when we talk about shareholder activism: voice and exit. So what we basically did is trying to understand by means of our questionnaire what are the choices that institutional investors have. And one broad pattern that we have discovered is that a lot of the engagement happens behind the scenes. What does that mean? Well, it means that you don't observe this. So you may think investors tend to be passive, while in fact they aren't. A lot of big institutional investors very actively engage their portfolio firms, but it's behind the scenes, so the public will not necessarily know this. So as long as institutional investors achieve the demands behind the scenes, they will stay behind the scenes and will not go public. So for example, we find that a lot of investors say that they actively contact non-executive directors or the supervisory board in order to ask for changes. So this is one broad pattern. And only basically if these behind the scenes engagements are not successful, they would go out loudly and publicly, for example, at the shareholder meeting, for example, by voting against management, etc. Right? So this is a pretty important finding because it actually suggests that a lot of institutional investors are much more active behind the scenes than we used to think. Now, the second broad pattern that arises from our questionnaire is that apart from these behind the scenes engagements, there's a lot of exit that institutional investors use as a governance mechanism. So they're not just selling for liquidity considerations or portfolio reshuffling reasons, but they're actually selling or threatening to sell because they think that this works as a governance mechanism to improve the governance, the performance of their portfolio firms. By threatening to sell the shares in the portfolio, they believe they can achieve a change in the portfolio companies. So these are the two broad patterns that I think one can really highlight when it comes to the results from the survey. So one very interesting question is, what causes investors to engage? What are the triggers of engagement? And we've again also used our survey here to directly ask them. And what is actually very interesting is that engagement is not triggered by some kind of short-term demands, such as higher dividends, etc. Engagement is triggered by concerns over the long-run strategy of a firm and because of concerns over corporate governance issues. So, for example, if there are concerns about compensation, that would be a trigger for institutional investors to start engaging their portfolio firms. If they believe that compensation is poorly structured, if they believe that compensation is too high. So this is interesting because it means that engagement, shareholder activism, is not primarily something that short-term oriented investors do. It's something that investors do because of concerns, the long-run strategy of the firm, because of concerns over governance. And in fact, what we in addition find, if we measure the intensity of engagement, the intensity of voice, we find that more long-term oriented investors tend to also be more active when it comes to voice. So also here, the finding very strongly suggests that engagement, shareholder activism, is not something primarily conducted by short-term investors, but it's rather something that long-term oriented investors do. So it's a good thing overall. So even so, we find that there is a lot of engagement by the institutional investors that we survey. It's still a concern that given the number of shares they have in their portfolios, they may remain passive with a large chunk of these portfolio firms. So what we try to understand is, what are the impediments to engagement? Why do some investors not engage? What are the legal or economic hurdles, so to speak? Now, basically, when it comes to the economic impediments, we find it's mostly about free rider concerns. So here's the potential problem an institutional investor faces. He has a small stake in the firm, but an interest in improving the governance. But at the same time, because of the small stake, he has a certain cost to cover. Because the cost of engagement is a fixed cost, it's not covered by the other institutional investors in that firm or other investors more generally. So if you consider engagement, you think about carrying all the costs, but only getting a fraction, the stake size, of the benefits. So some investors, as a result of these concerns that there's free riding by other investors, decide not to engage. Or at least I should say it's an impediment to engagement. And we also hear from the survey that in addition to this rationale, it's a related aspect. They say they may not engage because they have too little personnel, because they have too many firms in their portfolio. So this is all around, as we like to say, collective action problems or free rider problems. In addition, there are also, apart from these economic aspects, legal aspects why some institutional investors may not engage. In principle, you can say, why don't investors jointly coordinate? In total, they can share the costs of engagement and then achieve changes in portfolio companies. Well, one reason why they do this only to a small extent is because of legal concerns. Because if you coordinate, there's quickly the question, well, is this a concerted action? Is this acting in concert? And in lots of jurisdictions around the world, there are potential problems if there's collective engagement. So investors are concerned about violating legal rules, and therefore an additional reason, apart from these free rider problems, for not engaging is that they are concerned that they may violate, if they engage with others, legal rules on concerted shareholder activism. So I would say the big finding of our paper is that activism takes place behind the scenes. And this is important because it's not that if you don't see anything happening that investors are passive. Well, they're active, at least those that we surveyed. It's just that you don't see it. Now, this means also that from a governance perspective, it would be very, very important to try to understand better these hidden channels that investors use to increase the value of the portfolio firms. So there's already some research that goes in this direction. There's great research on hedge fund activism, trying to understand how hedge funds exactly engage. There's also some great research that looks at individual investors, and researchers got access to the minutes of the investors, the exact documentation of engagement. So there's more of this research out there that is very insightful. And so in terms of directions, I think it would be interesting to broaden this further, to maybe also have interviews with portfolio managers, governance experts, to try to understand what exactly these behind the scenes channels are that institutional investors use.